The next morning, the group was already hard at work integrating the new gear into the loom mill. Ren was setting up motion sensors near the main entrance, Patch was organizing the medical supplies, and Scotty was gleefully testing out the drone's maneuverability. Johnny and Shade were in the main workspace, going over a map of the area and discussing additional security measures. The sound of approaching footsteps interrupted their work. The group instinctively tensed, their hands moving toward their weapons. Johnny glanced at Shade, who nodded, stepping toward the entrance with his sidearm ready. Ren, closer to the door, reached it first, her spear at the ready. Another guest. Ren muttered, her voice low. The door swung open, revealing a figure standing in the morning light. He was tall, with a familiar build and face, another Vanduke. He wore a jacket similar to Johnny's, though it looked worn and scuffed, and his eyes seemed shadowed, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Relax," the newcomer said, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm just here to talk." Johnny stepped forward, his hand resting on the magnum at his side. "Who are you?" The man smirked faintly. "I'm you, obviously." Another Vanduke. "Call me, well, that doesn't matter. Let's just say I've been following your work. Figured it was time to pay a visit." The group exchanged wary glances. Ren lowered her spear slightly, though her stance remained tense. Shade kept his gun at his side, but his eyes stayed locked on the visitor. "All right," Johnny said slowly. "What do you want?" The newcomer's smirk widened. "To help, of course. You've been doing good work, but you're still green. I've seen timelines like this fall apart, and I don't want that happening here. Think of me as a mentor." Something about his tone set Johnny on edge. The words were right, but the delivery was off, too smooth, too rehearsed. The smirk lingered a little too long, and the way his eyes moved over the group was unsettling, as if he were sizing them up for something. Johnny's hand tightened on the magnum. "Why now? Why show up today?" The other Vanduke shrugged. "Timing's everything. Besides, with all the noise you've been making lately, it was only a matter of time before I found you." Ren frowned, her grip on her spear tightening again. "Something feels off about this." Johnny's eyes narrowed. He stared at the visitor, his enhanced senses kicking in. Something wasn't right the way the man moved, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow despite the cool morning air. And then it hit him, a memory surfacing like a lightning bolt. His voice rang out, sharp and filled with alarm, "Bioslave." The visitor's expression shifted instantly. The smirk vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look. The atmosphere in the mill grew heavier, the air charged with tension. The group drew their weapons in unison, the barrels trained on the intruder. The bioslave straightened, its movements suddenly less fluid, more mechanical. "You're sharper than I expected," it said, its voice losing some of its warmth, becoming colder and more precise. But you're still predictable. Stand down, Johnny commanded, his magnum aimed at the bio-slave's chest. You're not leaving here until we figure out what you're doing. The bio-slave tilted its head, its expression eerily calm. I'm here to observe. To learn. You're a fascinating subject, Vanduke, one of the most resilient we've encountered. Ren stepped closer, her spear raised. Who sent you? FEAR. The imposter. The bio-slave's lips twitched into a faint smile. Does it matter? I exist to serve. My purpose is beyond your understanding. Scotty, gripping his shotgun tightly, took a step back. Johnny. What exactly is this thing? Johnny's voice was low and steady, his eyes locked on the bio-slave. A bio-slave is what happens when someone, usually someone like me, gets captured by the imposter. They're stripped of free will, their bodies and minds altered to serve his agenda. Think of it as a living puppet. The bio-slave's gaze flicked to Johnny, its smile widening. Puppet. That's an oversimplification. I am perfection. Free of doubt, free of fear. You could be too, Vanduke. Johnny's finger twitched on the trigger. Not interested. The bio-slave stepped forward, its movements unsettlingly smooth. You don't have to be afraid of me. I'm not here to harm you. Not yet. Ren moved to block its path, her spear inches from its chest. Try anything, and you'll regret it. The bio-slave didn't flinch. Its cold, unblinking eyes shifted between them, calculating. You're making a mistake. Resistance is futile. The imposter sees all, knows all. You can't win this war. Johnny's jaw tightened. We'll see about that. For now, you're not going anywhere. The group tightened their circle around the bio-slave, weapons raised, the tension in the room palpable. The creature remained eerily calm, its confidence unnerving. For now, it seemed content to wait, but Johnny knew better than to trust its apparent compliance. Shade, Johnny said quietly, his eyes never leaving the bio-slave. Secure it? We need answers. Shade nodded, stepping forward with practiced precision. The bio-slave didn't resist as Shade began restraining it, but its faint smile suggested it had plans of its own. You think you can contain me, it said, its voice dripping with condescension. You'll learn soon enough. You can't stop what's coming. Johnny's eyes hardened, his voice cold. We'll see about that. The tension in the room exploded as the bio-slave made its move. In a flash, it twisted out of Shade's grip, its movements unnaturally fast and precise. Its arm lashed out, catching Shade across the chest and sending him sprawling backward. Ren lunged with her spear, but the bio-slave dodged effortlessly, its cold, calculating eyes locked on Johnny. Predictable, it said in a mechanical monotone, stepping toward Johnny with unnerving precision. You rely too much on your weapons. Your strength means nothing against me. Johnny raised his magnum and fired, the shot echoing through the mill. The bullet struck the bioslave's shoulder, but it barely flinched. Instead, it moved faster, closing the distance in a heartbeat. Before Johnny could fire again, the bioslave's hand shot out, gripping his wrist and twisting it. The magnum clattered to the floor as Johnny gritted his teeth against the pain. You're strong, the bioslave said, its voice emotionless. But not strong enough. With a sudden surge of force, it slammed Johnny against a nearby wall, pinning him in place. Ren and Scotty scrambled to intervene, but the bioslave's movements were too quick, its calculated efficiency keeping them at bay. Ren's spear struck air as the bioslave twisted around her attack, its elbow connecting with her ribs and knocking her to the ground. Scotty fired his shotgun, but the bioslave flickered, its body seeming to glitch momentarily as it dodged. The shot went wide, pellets scattering harmlessly into the wall. The bioslave turned its attention back to Johnny, its hand tightening around his throat. You should have joined us, it said, its voice low and deliberate. This defiance is pointless. Johnny struggled against its grip, his enhanced strength barely keeping the bioslave's crushing force at bay. His vision blurred as the creature leaned in closer, its expression a mockery of calm. Don't worry, it said softly. You'll make a fine addition to the collection. Suddenly, a deafening shot rang out, and the bioslave's head snapped to the side as a .44 Magnum round grazed its temple. It staggered, releasing Johnny and stumbling backward. The sound of boots hitting the floor echoed in the room as a new figure stepped out of the shadows. Looks like I got here just in time, the orphan said, his .44 Magnum smoking in his hand. His youthful face was hardened with resolve, and his eyes blazed with determination. You all right, Johnny? Johnny coughed, catching his breath as he slid down the wall. I been better, he muttered, pushing himself up. Nice timing. The bioslave recovered quickly, its head snapping toward the orphan. Another Vanduke, it said, its voice colder now. And a child at that. How quaint. The orphan smirked, twirling his magnum with practiced ease. Child or not, I don't miss twice. The bioslave lunged at him, its movements a blur. But the orphan was ready. He fired again, the shot forcing the bioslave to twist mid-air to avoid a direct hit. The creature landed, its gaze narrowing as it assessed this new threat. Ren and Scotty regrouped, flanking the bioslave as Johnny retrieved his fallen magnum. The group formed a loose circle around the creature, weapons raised. The orphan held his ground, his expression unflinching. You've got guts, the orphan said, cocking his magnum. I'll give you that. But you're not walking out of here. The bioslave's smile returned, faint but mocking. You think numbers will save you? I've fought Vandukes stronger than any of you. This ends one way. Johnny raised his magnum, his voice steady. Yeah, it does. But not the way you think. The standoff crackled with tension, the air heavy with the anticipation of violence. The bio-slave's cold, calculating gaze flickered between its opponents, clearly re-evaluating its strategy. For now, it didn't strike, but its predatory posture made it clear that the fight was far from over. The battle erupted into chaos as the bio-slave moved with deadly precision, dodging and countering every attack. It seemed to anticipate their moves, its mechanical efficiency making it a nearly unstoppable force. The Vandukes worked in tandem, their enhanced reflexes keeping them in the fight, but even together, they struggled to match the creature's speed and strength. Ren thrust her spear at the bio-slave, aiming for its torso, but it sidestepped and caught the shaft mid-air, twisting it out of her hands and hurling it aside. Shade moved in with a tactical strike, his blade slashing toward the creature's side, but the bio-slave ducked low, sweeping his legs out from under him. Johnny and the orphan fired their magnums in unison, their shots forcing the bio-slave to weave and flicker. The creature closed the distance with a blur of motion, kicking Johnny's weapon from his hand before spinning toward the orphan. The younger Vanduke barely dodged, rolling to the side and firing again as he regained his footing. This thing's not going down easy. Scotty yelled from the sidelines, his shotgun loaded but unsteady in his hands. We know. Ren shouted back, scrambling to retrieve her spear. Johnny narrowed his eyes, his voice sharp. Scotty, stay back. Will. No. Scotty cut him off, his eyes darting to the corner of the room where the old generators they decommissioned the night before sat, their metal casings dented and rusted. A plan was already forming in his mind. You Vandukes just keep it busy. Get it near those generators. What are you planning? The orphan called, ducking under a swipe from the bio-slave. Trust me. Scotty shouted. Just do it. Johnny exchanged a glance with the orphan and nodded. You heard him. Push it back. The Vandukes adjusted their attacks, forcing the bio-slave toward the corner of the mill. Ren and Shade joined in, their coordinated strikes keeping the creature on the defensive. Johnny landed a punch to its side, the impact staggering it just enough for the orphan to land a shot to its leg. The bio-slave stumbled, its movements momentarily disrupted. You're persistent, the bio-slave hissed, its voice colder now, laced with frustration. But it won't save you. Ren drove her spear into the ground, blocking one of its escape routes, while Shade moved to flank it from the other side. Slowly, they herded it closer to the generators. Scotty stood near the corner, his shotgun raised. His palms were sweaty, and his heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was steady. He waited until the bio-slave was within range, its back nearly brushing against the decrepit machines. Now. Johnny shouted, stepping back to give Scotty the opening. Scotty pulled the trigger, the shotgun roaring as the buckshot slammed into the nearest generator. The old machine sparked violently, a shower of electricity bursting from its exposed wires. The chain reaction ignited the others, the entire row of generators erupting in a cascade of sparks and smoke. The bioslave let out a distorted, mechanical cry as the electrical surge engulfed it. Its body spasmed, glitching violently as the current overwhelmed its systems. It staggered, sparks flying from its joints, its cold confidence replaced by frantic movements. Johnny and the others pulled back, shielding their eyes from the bright flashes. The bioslave collapsed to one knee, its body twitching as the remnants of the surge coursed through it. For a moment, the room was filled only with the crackle of dying electricity and the faint whine of the disabled generators. Scotty lowered his shotgun, his chest heaving. Did that work? The bioslave twitched, its head snapping up. Its movements were slower now, less precise, but it wasn't down yet. Its cold, mechanical voice cut through the air, warped and uneven. You won't stop the inevitable. Johnny stepped forward, retrieving his magnum and aiming it at the creature. You're not going anywhere. Not until we get some answers. The bioslave's body flickered again, struggling to rise. Despite its damaged state, it still radiated a chilling sense of determination. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, the group had the upper hand. Johnny's voice was firm, cutting through the tension in the room. We're dismantling it. I want its memory core intact. There's no telling what kind of intel it has. The bioslave twitched, its movements sluggish but still deliberate. It tried to rise again, but Ren stepped forward and drove her spear into the ground next to its shoulder, pinning it in place. Shade approached cautiously, his blade in hand, while the orphan kept his magnum trained on the creature's head. Johnny knelt beside the bioslave, his enhanced senses scanning its damaged frame. Sparks still flickered from its joints, and the faint hum of internal systems trying to reboot filled the air. It's resilient, Shade muttered, his tone a mix of respect and caution. But it's not indestructible. Johnny glanced at him. We need the core. You're the one with the tech expertise, can you get it? Shade nodded, stepping closer and examining the bioslave's torso. It'll take a minute. Cover me. Ren and the orphan moved into defensive positions, while Scotty kept his shotgun ready, though his hands still trembled slightly. Johnny stood over Shade, his magnum aimed at the bioslave's head as Shade began his work. Shade pulled out a multi-tool from his belt, his movements precise as he pried open a panel on the creature's chest. The bioslave hissed faintly, its voice glitching as it tried to speak. You cannot win. Johnny's jaw tightened. Maybe not today. But you're not walking out of here. Shade worked quickly, cutting through wires and bypassing fail-safes. Sparks flew as he removed a series of components, exposing a glowing, crystalline core nestled deep within the bioslave's chest cavity. The light from the core pulsed faintly, its rhythm uneven. "This is it," Shade said, reaching for the core. "It's encrypted, but if we can decrypt it, we'll have everything: data, directives, maybe even its connection to the imposter." The bioslave's voice grew faint but defiant. "You will only delay the inevitable." Shade ignored it, carefully extracting the core. The moment it was free, the bioslave's body twitched violently before going still, the faint hum of its systems finally ceasing. Shade held up the core, its light reflecting in his sharp eyes. "Got it?" Johnny stood over the lifeless shell of the bioslave, his expression grim as Shade carefully placed the memory core onto the workbench. The faint glow from the core pulsed irregularly, casting eerie shadows across the room. The orphan leaned against the wall, reloading his magnum with a calm efficiency that belied the tension still lingering in the air. Johnny turned to the younger Vanduke, his voice low but edged with frustration. "How are these things still around? I thought the Vandukes gave them their independence, freed them from the imposter's control." The orphan's eyes flicked to the memory core, his expression unreadable. He holstered his magnum before speaking, his tone quiet but filled with a weight far beyond his years. "It's not that simple, Johnny. In the multiverse, time isn't linear, not really. It's not even consistent. The flow of time happens all at once and not at all at the same time. It's messy." Johnny frowned, crossing his arms. "Messy how?" The orphan stepped forward, his hands in his pockets as he considered his words. "Think of it this way, everything that has ever happened, will happen, or could happen is all happening simultaneously in the multiverse. That means anything from any point in time can slip through. It doesn't matter how many years have passed or how many years are left until it's supposed to show up. Time doesn't work like it does in a single timeline." Ren leaned against the workbench, her spear resting beside her. "So, what? These bioslaves are just remnants. Stragglers from some point in time." The orphan shook his head. "Not exactly. They're as real and current as we are right now. Just like us, they're tied to fixed points in time. And as long as those points exist somewhere in the multiverse, they'll keep slipping through." Johnny's jaw tightened. "You're saying this is how the imposter and the false storyteller are still out there? Even though we killed them?" The orphan nodded, his gaze steady. "Exactly. They exist because there are established points in time where they're alive. It doesn't matter that we beat them in our own timelines, those fixed points ensure they'll always exist somewhere. Kill them in one moment, and they still exist in another. It's like trying to wipe out a shadow when the light source keeps moving." Scotty let out a low whistle, leaning back against a crate. "That's unsettling." Ren narrowed her eyes, her tone skeptical. So what's the point of fighting them if they'll always exist? How do we win against something like that? The orphan's expression darkened, a flicker of pain crossing his face. You don't win, not in the way you're thinking. You can't erase them completely, but you can contain them. Isolate their influence. Stop them from spreading their chaos to places they shouldn't reach. Johnny's gaze hardened. And what about us? Are we just as fixed in time? The orphan hesitated for a moment before nodding. In a way, yeah. Every Vanduke is tied to specific points, just like the imposter and the false storyteller. The difference is, we fight to preserve balance, not disrupt it. That's why we'll always be drawn to places like this, focal points where timelines converge. Ren sighed, running a hand through her hair. Great. So we're stuck playing multiversal janitors for eternity. The orphan smirked faintly, though there was little humor in it. It's not glamorous, but it's what we do. And if we don't, the chaos wins. Johnny stared at the memory core, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes. His voice was steady, but there was a cold edge to it. Then we start here. We crack this thing open, figure out what it knows, and make sure it can't slip through again. The orphan nodded, his youthful face hardening with resolve. That's the spirit. Just remember, Johnny, no matter how many times we knock them down, they'll always try to get back up. It's our job to make sure they don't. Shade worked diligently at the workbench, his multi-tool carefully prying open the casing of the bioslave's memory core. The faint hum of its internal systems pulsed irregularly, as if resisting the intrusion. The group gathered around him, their expressions tense as they waited for answers. Almost there, Shade muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. A final click echoed through the room as the core's outer shell detached, revealing a crystalline network of circuits and glowing nodes. He connected the core to one of their scavenged terminals, the monitor flickering to life with streams of encrypted data. All right, Shade said, tapping keys rapidly. Let's see what this thing knows. Lines of code scrolled across the screen, interspersed with fragments of maps, directives, and timelines. The system buzzed as it decrypted the information, breaking it down into readable segments. Ren leaned over Shade's shoulder, her spear resting against the edge of the table. What are we looking at? She asked. Shade pointed to a section of the map on the screen. These are coordinates. Looks like several points of interest. The screen displayed a list of locations, each marked with cryptic notations. Some were crossed out, while others glowed faintly, indicating active status. All right, here we go, Shade said, highlighting one of the entries. Maytown. Johnny's eyes narrowed. Maytown? That's not far from here. What does it say? Shade clicked on the entry, and a new screen opened. It displayed a rough map of Maytown, but the details were sparse. The data linked to the location was fragmented, as if part of it had been deliberately erased or corrupted. However, one note stood out. Server node linked, location unknown. Server node. Ren asked, frowning. What does that mean? Shade leaned back slightly, his tone thoughtful. It means this core was connected to a larger system. Maytown was either a hub or a relay point, but the exact location of the server it's tied to isn't listed. Either it's hidden, or the data's been wiped. Scotty crossed his arms, his expression skeptical. So we've got a mystery server in the middle of nowhere. Great. That doesn't sound like a trap at all. The orphan, leaning casually against the wall, spoke up. It's not just any server. If it's linked to a bioslave, it's part of the Imposter's network. That means it could contain critical data coordinates, directives, even logs of his movements. Johnny stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. And it's our best lead. We're going to Maytown. Shade nodded, his focus back on the monitor. Let me dig a little deeper, see if there's anything else we can pull from this core before we move. If we're walking into a trap, I'd rather know ahead of time. Ren turned to Johnny, her expression cautious. Maytown's not exactly a big place. If there's something there, it won't be hard to find or for it to find us. Johnny's voice was steady but firm. We don't have a choice. If this leads us to the Imposter's network, we can't ignore it. Whatever's in Maytown, we'll deal with it. The group fell silent as Shade continued working, their resolve hardening. The loom mill buzzed softly with the hum of machinery, but the tension in the air was palpable. Maytown was their next step, and whatever awaited them there, they knew it wouldn't be simple or safe. The group spent the next few hours preparing for the trip to Maytown. Shade worked tirelessly to pull as much information as possible from the memory core while Ren and Scotty double-checked their weapons and gear. The orphan sat off to the side, tinkering with his own magnum, his youthful face hardened with focus. Johnny paced near the workbench, his mind racing. The fragmentary data from the core gnawed at him. Maytown, the server node, the missing pieces. Whatever they were walking into, it felt deliberate, like they were being lured there. He didn't like it, but it was the only lead they had. Shade finally leaned back from the monitor, rubbing his temples. That's all I can get for now, he said, his voice weary but determined. The data's corrupted, but here's what we know. Maytown was used as a relay point for some kind of operation. Whatever server it's linked to is buried deep, probably off the grid or physically hidden. Ren frowned. And there's no indication of what they were doing there? No specifics. Shade shook his head. Not much. But there's a recurring directive linked to Maytown: preserve and protect node integrity. That tells me it's important, probably more important than they want us to know. Scotty groaned, slinging his shotgun over his shoulder. Great. So we're heading into the middle of nowhere to poke at something the bad guys really don't want poked. What could possibly go wrong? Johnny stopped pacing, his voice cutting through the room. Enough complaining. We're going. Everyone gear up. We leave in 10. The group moved into action, packing the van with weapons, supplies, and the new tech they'd integrated into their arsenal. Ren carried her spear, its sharp tip gleaming under the mill's floodlights, while Shade brought along a tactical kit filled with tools and sensors. The orphan secured his magnum, his expression unreadable as he climbed into the van. The drive to Maytown was quiet, the tension palpable as the group processed what lay ahead. The van rattled softly over uneven back roads, the dense forests on either side casting long shadows under the pale light of the moon. What do we know about Maytown? Ren asked, breaking the silence. Johnny glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Not much. It's small, barely a dot on the map. A few houses, a church, maybe a store or two. If there's a server node there, it's not going to be in plain sight. Shade nodded. We'll need to sweep the area. Look for signs of tampering, buildings that don't belong, infrastructure that seems out of place. Scotty shifted in his seat, his voice uneasy. And what happens when we find it? You know it's not just going to be sitting there unguarded. Johnny's expression hardened. Then we deal with it? Same as always. They reached Maytown just after midnight, the van rolling to a stop on the edge of the small settlement. The town was eerily quiet, the faint glow of streetlights casting an unsettling stillness over the empty streets. A few houses lined the main road, their windows dark, and an old church loomed at the center of the town, its steeple silhouetted against the night sky. Welcome to the middle of nowhere, Scotty muttered, his shotgun resting across his lap. Johnny cut the engine, his voice low. Stay sharp. If there's anything here, we'll know soon enough. The group exited the van, their weapons at the ready as they fanned out. Shade activated a handheld scanner, its screen glowing faintly as it began searching for anomalies. The orphan moved silently alongside him, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows. Ren approached Johnny, her spear in hand. Where do we start? Johnny gestured toward the church. That's the most obvious place. If there's a server node, it'll need a structure to house it. Start there. The group moved cautiously through the deserted streets, their footsteps muffled against the cracked pavement. The church loomed larger as they approached, its heavy wooden doors standing slightly ajar. A faint hum emanated from within, barely audible but unmistakable. Johnny exchanged a glance with Ren. You hear that? She nodded, her grip tightening on her spear. Yeah. Sounds mechanical. Shade glanced at his scanner, his expression tense. It's coming from inside. Whatever's in there, it's active. Johnny led the way, pushing the door open with one hand, his magnum raised in the other. The interior of the church was dark, the faint hum growing louder as they stepped inside. Rows of pews stretched toward the altar, but the air was thick with the metallic tang of machinery. At the far end of the room, behind the altar, a faint glow illuminated the shadows. A large metal hatch was set into the floor, its edges sealed with reinforced bolts. The hum emanated from beneath it, accompanied by the faint flicker of lights along its edges. Scotty whistled low, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's not supposed to be there." Johnny approached the hatch, his jaw tightening. "No, it's not." Ren scanned the room, her voice sharp. "If this is the server node, where's the security? This feels too easy." As if on cue, the hum grew louder, and the air around them seemed to shift. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from the shadows, growing closer with each passing moment. Johnny's voice was steady but cold. "Everyone, get ready. We're not alone." The shadows at the far end of the church shifted, and the faint glow from the hatch illuminated figures emerging from the darkness. One by one, they stepped into view, tall, humanoid shapes with twisted, mechanical features. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their movements were unnervingly fluid yet precise, like marionettes controlled by invisible strings. "Bioslaves," Ren muttered, her spear raised. "Of course." Shade's scanner beeped wildly, its screen lighting up with warnings. "They were waiting for us," he said, his tone grim. "This whole setup is a trap." Johnny aimed his magnum at the nearest bioslave, his voice steady. "It's not a trap if we spring it on our terms. Everyone hold your ground." The bioslaves moved in unison, their motions eerily coordinated as they closed the distance. Their voices blended into a distorted chorus, fragments of phrases and commands spilling out like broken recordings. "Preserve the node. Intruders will be eliminated. Comply." Scotty took a step back, his shotgun trembling in his hands. "Yeah, no thanks, not complying." The first bioslave lunged, its arms extending unnaturally as it swiped at Johnny. He fired a shot, the bullet slamming into its shoulder and forcing it back, but it didn't go down. Instead, it twisted its body unnaturally, the damaged limb snapping back into place. "These things are tougher than the last one," Scotty shouted, firing his shotgun. The blast staggered another bioslave, but it kept advancing, its mechanical limbs sparking faintly. Ren stepped forward, driving her spear into the chest of the nearest bioslave. It hissed and convulsed, but its hands shot out, grabbing the shaft and wrenching it to the side. Ren yanked the spear free, narrowly dodging its counterattack. The orphan moved with calculated precision, his magnum firing in rapid succession. Each shot hit its mark, tearing into the bioslave's limbs and torsos. "Aim for the joints," he shouted. "It's their weak point." Johnny and Shade coordinated their attacks, using their combined firepower to disable one of the bioslaves. It collapsed to the floor, its limbs twitching as sparks flew from its damaged frame. But more emerged from the shadows, their glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. "There's too many of them," Shade called, backing toward the group. "We need to get to that hatch and disable whatever's powering them." Johnny nodded, his voice firm. "Scotty, Ren, cover us. Orphan, with me." The group fell into a defensive formation, Scotty and Ren holding the line as Johnny and the orphan made their way toward the glowing hatch. The bio-slaves pressed in, their movements relentless and unyielding. Ren swept her spear in a wide arc, forcing two of the bio-slaves back. "Whatever you're doing, do it fast." Scotty fired another shotgun blast, reloading quickly as he shouted, "Not gonna lie, I could use less motivation to keep them off you." Johnny reached the hatch, his enhanced strength allowing him to pull at the reinforced bolts holding it in place. The orphan stood guard, his magnum barking as he took down another bio-slave. "We need to blow it open," Johnny said, gritting his teeth as he pulled at the stubborn bolts. "Shade, you got anything for this?" Shade tossed him a small explosive charge, his movements quick and precise. "Plant this. It'll do the trick." Johnny nodded, slapping the charge onto the hatch and activating the timer. The bio-slaves surged toward them, their distorted voices growing louder. "Unauthorized access, eliminate intruders, protect the node. Fall back," Johnny shouted, pulling the orphan with him as the group retreated to the far side of the church. The charge detonated with a deafening blast, the hatch blowing open in a cloud of smoke and sparks. The hum from below grew louder for a moment, then faltered, the bio-slaves freezing mid-motion as if their strings had been cut. "They're stopping," Ren shouted, her spear still raised. The bio-slaves stood motionless, their glowing eyes dimming as the server node's power waned. One by one, they collapsed to the ground, their mechanical forms lifeless. Scotty let out a shaky breath, his shotgun still aimed at the fallen bio-slaves. "Did we just win?" Johnny approached the smoking remains of the hatch, peering into the darkness below. "For now. But this isn't over. Whatever's down there, it's the key to all of this." Ren and the orphan joined him, their weapons at the ready. Shade scanned the remains of the bio-slaves, his expression grim. "We just made a lot of noise. If there's more of them, they'll know we're here." Johnny's voice was cold but resolute. "Then let's make sure we're ready. We're going in." Johnny dropped into the newly blasted hatch, his boots landing with a heavy thud on the metal floor below. The faint glow of emergency lights flickered, illuminating a narrow corridor lined with exposed wires and reinforced panels. The air was heavy with the scent of burned circuitry, and the faint hum of the server's power core echoed through the space. Ren followed close behind, her spear at the ready, while the orphan climbed down silently, his magnum scanning the shadows. Scotty came next, muttering under his breath as he gripped his shotgun tightly. Shade brought up the rear, his scanner active and sweeping the corridor for any remaining threats. "This doesn't feel like an ordinary server room," Ren muttered, her voice low. "Feels more like a bunker." "That's because it is," Shade replied, glancing at his scanner. "This place is reinforced like it was built to survive a war. Whatever they were doing here, they didn't want anyone finding it." Johnny moved cautiously down the corridor, his eyes scanning for traps or signs of movement. "Or they didn't want anyone getting out." Scotty groaned softly. "Why does everything you say sound like the setup for a horror movie?" The corridor ended in a large, circular chamber. The room was dominated by a towering server rack at its center, its panels glowing faintly with pulsing lights. Cables snaked out from the server, connecting to consoles and machinery lining the walls. The air was colder here, the hum of machinery louder and more oppressive. Shade stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he inspected the server. "This is advanced tech way beyond anything we've seen from the bioslaves. If I had to guess, this is the central hub for their operations in this region." Ren circled the room, her spear held steady. "Any chance it's still active?" Shade nodded grimly. "Definitely. Whatever's powering it survived the blast. It's damaged, but still operational." Johnny approached the server, his hand brushing against one of the glowing panels. "Can we pull any data from this? Find out what they were doing here?" Shade hesitated. "Maybe. But it's risky. If this thing has defensive measures, digital or physical, it could react badly to us tampering with it." The orphan, who had been silently inspecting the room, spoke up. "We don't have a choice. If this is tied to the imposter's network, it could give us everything we need to track his movements or warn us about his next move." Scotty leaned against the wall, his shotgun resting on his shoulder. "Yeah, great. And what happens if this thing decides to wake up more bioslaves instead?" Johnny's jaw tightened. "We take the risk." "Shade, get to work." Shade nodded reluctantly, pulling a portable interface device from his kit and connecting it to the server. The screen of the device lit up, streams of data flooding the display. Shade's fingers flew across the keys, his brow furrowed in concentration. "All right," he muttered, "I'm in, sort of. There's a lot of encrypted data here. It's fragmented, but I can pull some key points." The room fell silent as Shade worked, the hum of the server filling the air. After a few tense minutes, he glanced back at the group, his expression grim. "This isn't just a relay point," he said. "It's a command node. The bioslaves in this region weren't just operating on instinct, they were taking orders directly from here." Ren frowned. "Orders from who?" Shade's fingers moved across the interface, decrypting another section of data. "That's the thing, it's not just the imposter. There are multiple directives here, each tied to different factions. Some are clearly tied to FEAR, but others. What? Johnny pressed. Shade's voice was cautious. Others are Vanduke specific. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Scotty let out a low whistle. So, what? Some rogue Vandukes playing general for these things. Not necessarily, the orphan said, stepping closer. Remember what I said about time in the multiverse? There could be fixed points where the imposter's network crosses paths with Vanduke operations. It doesn't mean it's one of us, just that it looks like us. Shade nodded, his focus back on the screen. There's more. This node was actively transmitting data before we got here. And there's one directive that's still active. Johnny stepped closer, his voice cold. What is it? Shade hesitated, then pulled up the directive on the display. The screen flickered, showing a single line of text. Initialize protocol, Alpha Harvest. Ren's grip tightened on her spear. That doesn't sound good. Johnny's eyes narrowed. What's Alpha Harvest? Shade shook his head. I don't know, but it's big. Whatever it is, it's linked to other nodes. This isn't the only server like this. It's part of something much larger. The orphan's expression darkened. If this is part of the imposter's long-term plan, we need to shut it down. Now. Johnny turned to Shade. Can you disable it? Shade hesitated. I can try, but if I do, it might trigger fail-safes. This place could go up in smoke or worse. Johnny's voice was firm. Do it? We can't let this thing stay active. Shade nodded reluctantly, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he worked to disable the server. The room's hum grew louder, the lights on the server flickering erratically. The group tensed, their weapons at the ready, as the server's systems began to shut down. The hum faded, replaced by a low, ominous whine. The lights flickered once more, then went dark. Shade stepped back, his breath unsteady. It's done. Nodes offline. Johnny scanned the room, his magnum steady in his hand. Good. Let's get out of here before anything else wakes up. The group moved quickly, retreating back up the corridor and into the night. The church stood silent and still as they exited, the faint glow of the destroyed hatch the only sign of what had transpired. As they climbed back into the van, Johnny glanced at the orphan. This isn't over, is it? The orphan shook his head. Not even close. But we've slowed them down for now. Johnny's jaw tightened as he started the engine. The van rumbled to life, and the group drove into the darkness, the weight of their discovery pressing heavily on their shoulders. The van rolled to a stop on the edge of a quiet clearing deep in the woods. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the group as they climbed out. The air was cold and still, the faint rustle of leaves the only sound. Johnny leaned against the hood of the van, his magnum still in hand. Ren stood nearby, her spear resting against her shoulder, while Scotty paced nervously, his shotgun slung over his back. Shade was seated on the ground, scanning the data they'd managed to pull from the server node, while the orphan leaned against a tree, his youthful face unusually grim. "We need to talk about what just happened," Johnny said, breaking the silence. "That wasn't just a random trap. That server was part of something bigger, something coordinated." "Alpha Harvest," Ren muttered, her tone uneasy. "Whatever it is, it doesn't sound like it's over." Scotty stopped pacing, throwing up his hands. "And let's not forget those bio-slaves. They weren't just grunts, they were coordinated, efficient. Like they knew us." Johnny's expression hardened. "They didn't know us. They knew me." The group fell silent, the weight of the implication settling over them. Before anyone could respond, the sound of snapping twigs and heavy footsteps echoed through the woods. Weapons came up instantly, the group forming a tight circle around a van. "Hold your fire," a familiar voice called out from the shadows. A figure emerged into the clearing, and the tension shifted. It was the hunter, the grizzled man who had first helped them fight the dogmen. He carried his rifle casually, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the group with a mix of relief and suspicion. "I figured I'd find you out here," he said, stopping a few feet away. "Saw the aftermath at the mill and noticed your map marker pointed to Maytown. What the hell's going on?" Johnny lowered his magnum slightly, his brow furrowed. "What are you doing here?" The hunter slung his rifle over his shoulder, stepping closer. "I've been tracking those androids, those bio-slaves, or whatever you call them. Stopped by the mill earlier, and it looked like a war zone. When I saw Maytown on the map, I came as fast as I could. Thought you might need a hand." Ren relaxed slightly, lowering her spear. "We handled it, but, yeah, it was bad." The hunter's gaze shifted to Johnny, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell were those things?" "They weren't just machines, they acted like you. Same build, same movements. It was like fighting you with the volume turned up to 11. Johnny tensed, his jaw tightening. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Finally, the hunter crossed his arms, his tone sharp. "All right, spill. What's going on here? What are you not telling me?" Johnny exhaled slowly, stepping away from the van. He glanced at the group, and they nodded, silently agreeing that the truth couldn't be avoided anymore. "They're called bio-slaves," Johnny began. "And you're right, they act like me because they were designed to. They're copies. Twisted versions of me, created by someone who's been manipulating the multiverse." The hunter blinked, his face a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "The what now?" Ren stepped in, her voice steady. "The multiverse. It's real, and it's a mess. There are infinite timelines out there, each with their own version of reality. And Johnny, well, his role in all of this is bigger than you can imagine. The hunter shook his head, clearly struggling to process. Bigger how? What makes him so special? Johnny hesitated for a moment, then rolled up his sleeve, revealing the glowing VCSN device on his arm. It's called the Vanduke Call Sign Network. Every version of me across the multiverse has one. It lets us track anomalies, communicate across timelines, and fight back against the chaos. The hunter's eyes widened as he stared at the device. And those bio-slaves? They're tied to this multiverse nonsense. The orphan spoke up, his tone grim. They're tied to the Imposter, another version of Johnny. A rogue Vanduke who's been trying to take over the multiverse. He created the bio-slaves to serve him, living puppets stripped of free will. The hunter's expression darkened, his voice low. So, what? These things are part of his army. Johnny nodded. Yeah. And even though we've fought him before, even though we stopped him in our own timelines, he still exists. The multiverse is complicated. Time doesn't work the way we think it does. The hunter rubbed his face, letting out a frustrated sigh. And you're telling me all of this now because you deserve to know, Johnny said firmly. You've been part of this fight from the beginning. And if we're going to win, we need people like you, people who can fight back against whatever's coming. The hunter stared at him for a long moment, then glanced at the rest of the group. Finally, he let out a rough laugh, shaking his head. You kids really know how to pick your battles, don't you? Scotty smirked nervously. Yeah, it's kind of our thing. The hunter's laughter faded, replaced by a grim determination. All right. I'm in. But I'm not following you blind, and I'm not playing hero. If we're doing this, I need to know everything. Johnny extended a hand, his voice steady. You'll know what you need to. But for now, we need to get moving. This fight's far from over. The hunter shook his hand, nodding. Fine. But next time, don't wait until the monsters are breathing down my neck to clue me in. Johnny smirked faintly, turning back toward the van. Deal. Let's go. As the group gathered back around the van, the hunter lit a cigarette, his rough demeanor barely masking the bewilderment still etched across his face. He glanced at the orphan, his gaze narrowing. All right, you've told me about these bio-slaves, the multiverse, and all this Vanduke stuff. But what about him? He nodded toward the orphan. You said he's tied to you, but I don't get it. He's a kid. Johnny leaned against the van, arms crossed, his expression somber. He's not just tied to me. He is me, or a version of me. We call him the orphan. He's the youngest Vanduke in the multiverse. The hunter raised an eyebrow, exhaling a puff of smoke. Youngest? Huh? All right, kid. Let's hear it. What's your story? The orphan stepped forward, his youthful face a mixture of defiance and weariness. He adjusted the strap of his backpack, his small frame dwarfed by the weight of his presence. Fine, he said, his voice steady despite the heaviness of his words. I'll tell you. He glanced at the others, then fixed his eyes on the hunter. My timeline was different. I was 13 when it started. I lived in a small town, normal enough on the surface. But underneath, there was something wrong. People started disappearing, kids, mostly. My friends, my neighbors. They were taken by this thing. The orphan's eyes darkened, and his voice lowered. It wasn't human. It was a man in name only, the man behind the slaughter, we called him. He built these killer animatronics machines designed to hunt, capture, and kill. They were terrifying. You'd hear their laughter in the dark, their footsteps in the halls, and then someone would be gone. Ren shivered, gripping her spear tightly. Animatronics? Like robots? The orphan nodded. Yeah. But they weren't like the bio-slaves. These things weren't controlled, they were independent, vicious, and smart. They hunted for fun. I was just a kid, but I got caught up in it. I had to learn to fight back, to survive. I spent years hiding, running, and figuring out how to destroy them. Scotty swallowed hard. And the man behind the slaughter? What happened to him? The orphan's gaze hardened. I killed him. Took everything I had, but I did it. I thought it was over after that. But then the multiverse cracked open, and I found out my fight wasn't unique. I wasn't unique. There were other Vandukes, each with their own battles, their own monsters. The hunter exhaled, flicking ash onto the ground. And that's when you joined up with them. The orphan smirked faintly, his youthful bravado shining through. More like they found me. Johnny here was one of the first Vandukes I met. He helped me figure out what it all meant, what it meant to be part of something bigger. Johnny nodded, his voice quiet. The orphan's story is just one of many. Every Vanduke has their own timeline, their own challenges. But we're all connected through the multiverse, through the call sign. That's why we're here. The hunter studied the orphan for a moment, then nodded. All right, kid. I'll give you this, you've been through more than most grown men I know. I'll take your word for it. Before anyone could respond, the sound of faint footsteps broke the quiet. The group tensed, weapons coming up as they scanned the clearing. A figure stepped out of the shadows, his silhouette illuminated by the moonlight. He was lean, wiry, and dressed in patched-up street clothes that looked like they'd been scavenged from a dozen different places. A hood was pulled over his head, and his eyes glinted with sharp cunning. Slung across his back was a makeshift weapon, a modified crowbar wrapped in wires and metal plates. Well, Well, the newcomer said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Another Vanduke reunion. Didn't think I'd find you all so easily. Johnny lowered his magnum slightly, his brow furrowing. Who are you? The figure smirked, pulling back his hood to reveal a face strikingly similar to Johnny's, though rougher, more weathered. Name's Street Rat, he said. And let's just say I've been watching you for a while now. The orphan stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. You're another Vanduke? Street Rat shrugged. Guilty as charged. Been hopping through timelines, picking up scraps, and staying out of trouble. But lately, trouble's been finding me. Ren's spear remained raised. What kind of trouble? Street Rat's smirk faded, his expression turning serious. The kind that gets people like us killed. I ran into some of those bio-slaves you've been dealing with. Barely made it out alive. Figured I'd find the source of the problem, and here you are. Johnny sighed, gesturing for the others to lower their weapons. All right, Street Rat. If you've got information, spill it. We don't have time for games. Street Rat grinned, leaning casually against a tree. Oh, I've got plenty to share. But first, how about a warm welcome? I've been out there fighting alone for a long time. Johnny's expression softened slightly. You're not alone anymore. Welcome to the team. Street Rat's grin widened, though his eyes remained sharp. Good. Because something big's coming, and I think you're gonna need all the help you can get. The clearing was quiet for a moment after Street Rat's arrival, the tension in the air palpable. Then, from the shadows, two more figures stepped into view. One was tall and imposing, dressed in rugged gear and carrying himself with the confidence of a seasoned warrior, the hunter Vanduke. The other was a younger man with a hardened edge, his clothes resembling a patched-up vault jumpsuit, the Fallout Vanduke. The hunter Vanduke grinned, his voice carrying easily through the clearing. Good job beating the bio-slaves, kid. And the rest of you. You've shown great strength even without powers. That's rare. Fallout Vanduke nodded, his expression less jovial but no less impressed. You've held your ground against things most people wouldn't survive. That makes you worthy of what's coming next. The group stared in stunned silence as the two newcomers approached. Johnny stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. Hunter. Fallout. What are you doing here? The hunter Vanduke gestured towards Street Rat with a smirk. We got word that your little group had made some noise in Maytown. Street Rat here sent out a signal, and, well, we figured we'd better check in. Fallout Vanduke crossed his arms, his tone firm. And it looks like we came at the right time. There's a lot of work to do. The hunter Vanduke reached into his pack, pulling out a series of glowing devices, miniature versions of the call sign. He handed one to each member of Johnny's team, Ren, Scotty, Shade, and the hunter. "These are for you," the hunter Vanduke said, his tone serious. "You are among the very few non-multiversal beings to know of our existence and our fight. That makes you part of it now." The devices glowed faintly as they activated, their energy syncing with each recipient. Ren examined hers, her expression cautious but intrigued. "What do these do?" "They're call signs," Fallout Vanduke explained. "Not as powerful as the ones we carry, but enough to connect you to the network. You'll be able to communicate with us, track anomalies, and defend yourselves if things go sideways." Scotty blinked, holding the glowing device like it might bite him. "Wait, are you saying we're like officially part of this now?" The hunter Vanduke nodded, his voice grave. "You've earned it. You've fought alongside Johnny and his team. That makes you one of us in spirit, if not in blood." Fallout Vanduke's gaze swept over the group, his tone firm. "But with that comes responsibility. You need to be sparing with who you tell this story to. The more people who know, the more risk there is both to them and to us." The hunter Vanduke turned to Johnny, his expression softening slightly. "As for you, Johnny, you've done well. But there's still much for you to learn." Johnny tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. "What kind of training?" The hunter Vanduke's smirk returned. "We need to show you how to channel the power of the multiverse. Your gun? It could become a weapon that never needs reloading. Your clothes? We can make them unbreakable, untouchable by time or wear. And eventually when you're ready we'll teach you how to time jump." Fallout Vanduke added, his tone sharper. "But that's later. For now, you need to focus on strengthening your connection to the multiverse and mastering the tools you already have." The orphan leaned against a tree, watching the exchange with a faint smirk. "Guess you're in for the long haul now, Johnny." Johnny's gaze hardened, his resolve clear. "I've been in for the long haul since the Dogman. This is just the next step." The hunter Vanduke stepped back, his tone shifting to address the entire group. "We fight monsters, cryptids, nightmares. But more than that, we fight to make the nightmares afraid of the dark. If you're with us, you're with us for good." Ren stood tall, her spear resting on her shoulder. "We're with you. All of us." Scotty nodded, though his nervousness still showed. "Yeah, well, I didn't sign up for the multiverse, but I'm not leaving now." Shade smirked faintly, his tone dry. "Guess I'm in too. Someone has to keep you all alive." The hunter Vanduke clapped Johnny on the shoulder, his grin widening. "Then let's get to work. The fight's only just begun." The air in the clearing felt charged as the weight of the moment settled over everyone. The glow of the newly distributed call signs pulsed faintly, casting a soft light on the faces of Johnny's team. The hunter Vanduke looked over the group, his grin fading slightly as his tone turned serious. "The fight ahead isn't going to be easy. Every time we gain ground, the imposter and his creations find a way to push back. You've seen that already with the bio-slaves. But those were just the tip of the iceberg. There are far worse things out there. Fallout Vanduke stepped forward, his expression grim. He's right. You've proven you can handle yourselves, but that doesn't mean you're ready for what's coming. These call signs will help, but only if you learn to use them. Johnny looked at his team, the faint glow of their new devices reflected in his eyes. We're ready to learn. Whatever it takes. The orphan let out a low laugh, pushing off the tree he had been leaning against. You say that now, but trust me, this training isn't a walk in the park. I had to learn the hard way. Street Rat smirked, flipping his crowbar over his shoulder. Training or not, you've got to admit, they've got guts. That's a good start. Ren adjusted her grip on her spear, her voice steady. We've come this far. We're not backing down now. Scotty, still holding his call sign like it might explode, finally shook his head and clipped it to his belt. Yeah. Let's just hope this training doesn't involve more monsters trying to kill us. The hunter Vanduke turned to Johnny, his tone more instructive. The first thing you need to understand is that the call signs are more than just trackers or communication devices. They're tools for channeling multiversal energy. With focus and practice, you can infuse that energy into the things you use every day. Fallout Vanduke stepped closer, nodding. Your magnum, for example. With the right training, you can charge it with multiversal energy so it never runs out of ammo. It'll always be ready, no matter what. The hunter Vanduke added, or your clothes. With the right focus, you can weave multiversal threads into them, making them unbreakable. Bullets, blades, fire, nothing will touch you. Johnny's eyes narrowed slightly. And how do I do that? It starts with control, Fallout Vanduke said. You've already got a connection to the multiverse. That's what lets you sense anomalies and use the VCSN. But that connection is like a muscle. You need to strengthen it, learn to direct it. The orphan stepped forward, his voice more casual. Think of it like this: the multiverse is a giant power grid, and you're one of the only people with a key to the circuit breaker. But if you flip the wrong switch, you could overload yourself or worse. Shade, who had been quietly listening, crossed his arms. And what about the rest of us? We don't have your multiverse keys. What are we supposed to do? The hunter Vanduke turned to him, his expression serious. That's why you've got the call signs now. They won't give you the same powers as a Vanduke, but they'll let you access the network. You'll have advanced tracking, communication, and even some defensive capabilities. And you'll be able to coordinate with us in real time. Fallout Vanduke nodded. That might not sound like much, but trust me, it makes a difference. You've already proven you can hold your own against monsters without powers. With these tools, you'll be even more dangerous. Ren tilted her head, inspecting the glowing device on her wrist. So, we're basically multiversal foot soldiers now. The hunter Vanduke smirked. More like lieutenants. You're part of something much bigger now, but that also means more responsibility. Be careful who you trust and be sparing with who you tell this story to. Johnny straightened, his voice calm but firm. We understand. But what about time jumping? When do I learn that? Fallout Vanduke exchanged a glance with the hunter, then turned back to Johnny. Not yet. Time jumping is dangerous, more dangerous than anything you've done so far. One wrong move, and you could destabilize an entire timeline. It's not something you rush into. The hunter Vanduke nodded. For now, focus on mastering the basics. Once you've proven you can handle multiversal energy, we'll take you to the next step. Street Rat grinned, his tone teasing. Don't worry, Johnny. You'll get there. Just try not to blow yourself up in the meantime. The group exchanged faint smiles, the tension easing slightly. But the weight of their mission still lingered, a reminder of the challenges ahead. Johnny looked at his team, his gaze steady. We've got a lot to learn, he said. But we've already come this far. Let's keep going. The hunter Vanduke clapped him on the shoulder. That's the spirit. And remember, we don't just fight to survive. We fight to make the nightmares afraid of the dark. The group rolled up to the loom mill in the early hours of the morning, their van rattling over the uneven dirt road. The sight that greeted them brought the van to a screeching halt. Standing at the entrance were bio-slaves, their imposing forms illuminated by the soft glow of floodlights now surrounding the mill. The group erupted into chaos. Bio-slaves! Ren shouted, already reaching for her spear. Scotty fumbled with his shotgun, his voice a panicked jumble. They found us. How the hell did they find us? Shade and Johnny jumped out of the van, weapons drawn, their movements precise and ready for a fight. Even the orphan braced himself, his magnum aimed at the nearest android. Stand down, the hunter Vanduke's voice boomed from behind them. They're not hostile. Johnny froze mid-step, his magnum still aimed, but he glanced back at the hunter Vanduke, who had exited the van with Fallout, Street Rat, and the orphan close behind. What do you mean, not hostile? They're bio-slaves. Fallout Vanduke stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. They're not slaves anymore. These are bio-androids, the ones we freed during the war. The group hesitated, their weapons still raised. The bio-androids stood motionless, their glowing eyes steady but unthreatening. Their mechanical forms, though intimidating, lacked the cold malice of the bio-slaves they had fought in Maytown. Street Rat smirked, leaning on his crowbar. Looks like they've been busy while we were gone. Maybe you should take a closer look. Johnny cautiously lowered his magnum, his gaze narrowing. What are they doing here? The orphan stepped up beside him, gesturing to the mill. You'll want to see for yourself. The group moved as one, their tension still high but their curiosity growing. As they approached the mill, the changes became more apparent. The building, once a decaying relic of rusted metal and cracked beams, now looked pristine. The walls gleamed with fresh paint and reinforced plating, and the windows were no longer broken or grimy. The entrance was flanked by two bio-androids, their stance more like sentinels than soldiers. Ren frowned, gripping her spear tightly. Did we come to the wrong mill? This can't be ours. The hunter Vanduke grinned. It's yours, all right. Or at least, it was. Now it's better. Inside, the transformation was even more shocking. The once dusty and cluttered workspace had been completely overhauled. Multiversal scanners lined the walls, their glowing displays showing maps, timelines, and real-time data streams. A massive central console dominated the room, its holographic interface projecting an intricate map of Lancaster complete with layers tracking everything from weather patterns to anomalous activity. Johnny stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room in awe. What the? Shade, usually composed, couldn't hide his amazement. This place, it's like a command center. Who did this? Fallout Vanduke gestured to the bio-androids, who moved silently through the space, their movements efficient and deliberate. They did. After the war, the freed bio-androids needed a purpose. Some of them chose to rebuild. They've been tracking anomalies and repairing critical points across the multiverse. When we told them about you, they came here. Ren ran her hand over one of the pristine counters, her expression still skeptical. And they just decided to fix this place up. The hunter Vanduke nodded. They know what's at stake, and they understand the importance of what you're doing here. You're fighting the same war they've been fighting for years. This mill is now one of the best equipped bases in the multiverse. Scotty, still uneasy, pointed to a nearby scanner. What's all this stuff do? The orphan smirked, stepping to the central console. Everything. These scanners can track anomalies, map timelines, and even predict potential disturbances. And this, he gestured to the holographic map of Lancaster. This is your real-time tracker for the city. Every movement, every signal, every unexplained blip, it's all here. Shade approached the console, his analytical mind already at work. This changes everything. We can track anomalies before they happen. We'll know where to be before the enemy even shows up. Street Rat chuckled, leaning against the wall. Told you they were helpful. Johnny turned to the hunter Vanduke, his expression serious. This is incredible, but why? Why put so much effort into us? Fallout Vanduke stepped forward, his tone measured. Because you're the focal point of this timeline, Johnny. Lancaster, the mill, your team, it all revolves around you. The multiverse has decided this is where the fight matters most. We're here to make sure you have what you need. The hunter Vanduke clapped him on the shoulder, his grin returning. Now stop gawking and start using it. You've got the tools, the team, and the training coming your way. It's time to turn the tide. Ren finally set her spear down, her expression shifting to reluctant acceptance. All right. Let's see what this place can do. Scotty nodded, though he still seemed overwhelmed. Yeah, okay. But I'm not letting those androids get too close to me. Johnny smirked, stepping to the central console and placing his hand on its surface. The holographic map shifted, responding to his touch. For the first time, the mill didn't feel like just a hideout, it felt like a fortress. Let's get to work, he said. Johnny stood in the cleared-out training area of the newly renovated loom mill, the faint hum of multiversal scanners in the background. Fallout Vanduke and the hunter Vanduke stood nearby, watching him intently as he adjusted his stance. His magnum rested in his holster, and a pair of reinforced gloves adorned his hands, faintly pulsing with the energy he was learning to control. All right, Fallout Vanduke said, his voice calm but firm. You've already got the basics down. You can sense anomalies and use the VCSN to track them. But if you're going to keep up with the multiverse's worst, you need to make that power work for you. Johnny nodded, focusing. What's first? Ethereal vision, the hunter Vanduke said, stepping forward. You've felt it before, the way you can see things others can't. But you've only scratched the surface. With practice, you can use it to see through walls, track movements in complete darkness, and even detect traces of anomalies left behind. Johnny glanced at the hunter. And how do I control it? Most of the time, it just happens. That's because you're letting it, the hunter replied. The trick is focus. It's like flexing a muscle, start small and build from there. Close your eyes. Johnny obeyed, closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. The world around him dimmed, the sounds of the mill fading to a faint hum. Now, the hunter continued, his voice steady. Focus on what you want to see. Imagine the multiverse as layers, your timeline, and what's just beyond it. Peel back those layers. At first, Johnny saw only darkness. Then, faint shapes began to form, glowing outlines of the world around him. The walls of the mill faded, replaced by translucent layers of space and movement. He could see Scotty fiddling with the surveillance systems in the next room, Ren practicing with her spear outside, and even faint traces of the bio-androids as they moved with precision through the building. I see them, Johnny muttered, his voice tinged with awe. I see everything. Good, Fallout Vanduke said, stepping closer. But don't stop there. Ethereal vision isn't just about seeing. It's about understanding. Use it to track anomalies, to sense when the multiverse is bending, even before it happens. Johnny opened his eyes, the glowing outlines fading but the sensation lingering. Got it? What's next? Fallout Vanduke gestured to his magnum. Infusion. Your weapons and gear are just tools, but with multiversal power, they can become extensions of you. Your magnum, for example, what if it never needed reloading? What if every shot hit harder than anything your enemy could withstand? Johnny smirked faintly, drawing the weapon. Sounds good to me. How do I do it? The orphan, leaning casually against the wall, spoke up. It's all about focus, Johnny. The multiverse is like a river of energy, and the call sign lets you tap into it. You just have to direct that energy where you want it to go. Johnny stared at the magnum in his hand, focusing on the faint hum of the call sign on his arm. He imagined the energy flowing from the device, coursing through his body and into the weapon. At first, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the gun began to glow faintly, a soft, pulsing light emanating from its barrel. Good start, Fallout Vanduke said, nodding approvingly. Now fire. Johnny raised the magnum, aiming at a reinforced target set up across the room. He pulled the trigger, and a burst of energy shot from the barrel, slamming into the target with enough force to leave a smoking dent. Scotty poked his head into the room, his eyes wide. Okay, that's officially the coolest thing I've seen all week. Johnny lowered the gun, a satisfied smirk on his face. Not bad. The hunter Vanduke stepped forward, his tone turning serious. You're getting the hang of it, but there's more to learn. Infusion isn't just about power, it's about balance. If you channel too much energy, you'll burn yourself out or worse. Johnny nodded, his smirk fading as he absorbed the warning. Understood. What else? The training continued for hours, each lesson pushing Johnny further. He learned to strengthen his clothes, channeling energy into the fabric to make it impervious to blades and bullets. He practiced precision with ethereal vision, learning to sense even the smallest disturbances in the multiverse. By the end of the day, his body ached, but his resolve was stronger than ever. As the group gathered around the central console that evening, the hunter Vanduke placed a hand on Johnny's shoulder. You're coming along faster than I expected, kid. But remember, this is just the beginning. The multiverse is vast, and the enemies you'll face are unlike anything you've seen. Johnny nodded, his voice steady. Then I'll keep training. Whatever it takes. Fallout Vanduke smirked faintly. Good. Because the multiverse doesn't wait for anyone. The next morning, Johnny woke early, the faint glow of the call sign on his arm a comforting presence. The renovations to the loom mill had transformed not just the space but also the group's morale. It felt like they had a real shot now, a base that could track anomalies, advanced tools to help them fight, and a growing understanding of the power Johnny wielded. As he stepped into the training area, he found Fallout Vanduke waiting for him, leaning against a reinforced console with his arms crossed. The room was still, the faint hum of multiversal scanners providing the only sound. "Up early," Fallout said, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Good. We've got more to cover." Johnny stretched, rolling his shoulders. "What's next?" Fallout pushed off the console and gestured toward the far end of the room, where a line of holographic targets flickered into existence. Precision. It's one thing to blast holes in walls with your magnum. It's another to use that power effectively in a fight. Johnny frowned slightly, drawing the glowing magnum from its holster. "I thought I was doing fine." Fallout chuckled. "You're doing fine for a beginner. But fine doesn't cut it in the multiverse. You're going to face enemies who'll exploit every weakness, every hesitation. You need to be faster, sharper. Let's see how you do." The targets began to move, their flickering outlines darting unpredictably across the room. Johnny raised his magnum, his enhanced vision locking onto the first target. He fired, the energy blast hitting dead center. Before he could adjust, 2 more targets zipped past, and he missed. "Focus!" Fallout barked, stepping closer. Ethereal vision isn't just for tracking, it's for prediction. Use it to anticipate their movements. Johnny closed his eyes for a split second, the outlines of the targets glowing faintly in his mind. He adjusted his aim, firing again. This time, he hit both targets, their holographic forms dissolving into light. "Better," Fallout said. "But you're still reacting. You need to feel the multiverse around you, let it guide you." The exercise continued, the pace quickening as more targets appeared. Johnny's breathing steadied, his focus sharpening with each shot. By the end, the room was silent, every target eliminated. Fallout nodded approvingly. "Not bad. You're starting to get it?" Johnny holstered the magnum, sweat beading on his forehead. "What's next?" Before Fallout could answer, the hunter Vanduke entered the room, his expression grim. "Next is endurance. You're going to need it." He gestured for Johnny to follow, leading him outside to a cleared area near the edge of the mill's grounds. Ren and Scotty were already there, their call signs glowing faintly as they worked through their own training exercises. Street Rat leaned against a nearby tree, watching with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. "Endurance?" Johnny asked, glancing at the hunter. The hunter grinned. "Channeling multiversal energy takes a toll on your body. If you overdo it, you'll burn out fast. This next exercise is about learning your limits and pushing them." He tossed Johnny a weighted training vest, its surface covered in faintly glowing lines. "Put this on." Johnny slipped the vest over his shoulders, its weight pressing down immediately. "What's this supposed to do?" "It's a multiversal energy regulator," the hunter explained. "It increases resistance, forcing your body to work harder to channel energy. Think of it like training with weights. Johnny adjusted the straps, his movements slower under the added weight. And what's the goal? The hunter pointed to a set of holographic obstacles that materialized across the clearing. Make it through that course using everything you've learned. Johnny nodded, determination settling over him. He stepped to the starting line, activating ethereal vision as the course began to shift and move. The obstacles glowed faintly, their forms becoming clearer as he focused. The first challenge was a series of barriers, each one shifting unpredictably. Johnny moved quickly, his enhanced reflexes kicking in as he ducked, rolled, and leapt over each one. The vest's weight slowed him down, but he pushed through, his breathing steady. The next challenge was a series of moving targets, similar to the ones he had faced earlier. Johnny raised his magnum, the glowing weapon firing bursts of energy that struck each target with precision. The vest's resistance made his arms ache, but he kept firing, his shots improving with each attempt. By the time he reached the final challenge, a narrow bridge suspended over a simulated drop, Johnny's body was screaming in protest. The vest felt heavier with every step, and the glow of his call sign dimmed faintly. "Keep going," the hunter shouted from the sidelines. "You're almost there." Johnny gritted his teeth, activating ethereal vision to steady himself. The bridge swayed beneath him, but he focused on the glowing path ahead, his steps sure and deliberate. Finally, he reached the end, collapsing to one knee as he removed the vest. "You made it," the hunter said, his grin widening. "That's more than most can say." Johnny looked up, his chest heaving. "That was brutal." Fallout Vanduke stepped forward, helping him to his feet. "And necessary. The more you push yourself, the stronger you'll get. You'll need every ounce of strength for what's coming." Johnny straightened, the glow of the call sign on his arm steady once more. "Then let's keep going. I'm not stopping until I'm ready." The group exchanged approving glances, the weight of their shared mission settling over them. The multiverse wasn't going to wait, and neither would they. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the loom mill buzzed with the quiet energy of preparation. The other Vandukes, Hunter, Fallout, and Street Rat, gathered near the central console, their expressions a mix of satisfaction and resolve. Johnny stood with them, the glow of his call sign steady as he exchanged nods with each of them. The Hunter Vanduke was the first to speak, his tone firm but warm. "You've got a strong team here, Johnny. Stronger than I expected. You're holding your own, and with more training, you'll be ready for anything." Fallout Vanduke stepped forward, his expression serious. "But this is your fight now. We've done what we came to do, got you set up, gave you the tools you need. The rest is on you." Street Rat smirked, leaning casually on his crowbar. "Don't get too comfortable, though. The multiverse has a way of throwing curveballs. We'll be around if you need us." Just don't make it a habit of calling for backup." Johnny nodded, his voice steady. "I appreciate everything you've done. We couldn't have gotten this far without you." Hunter clapped him on the shoulder, his grin returning. "You'll do fine. Just remember, keep pushing. The multiverse doesn't wait, and neither do the monsters." As the three Vandukes activated their call signs, the air around them shimmered faintly. The orphan, standing a few feet away, crossed his arms and smirked. "Guess I'm the one sticking around, huh?" Hunter glanced at the orphan and nodded. "You're better suited to stay, kid. Johnny needs someone who understands what it's like to fight at his level. Keep him on track." Fallout Vanduke turned back to Johnny one last time. "And don't forget, this fight isn't just about monsters and anomalies. It's about protecting the people who can't protect themselves. That's why we're here." Johnny's expression hardened, his resolve clear. "I won't forget." With that, the three Vandukes vanished, their forms dissolving into shimmering light as they returned to their respective timelines. The room fell silent, the weight of their departure settling over the remaining group. The orphan broke the silence, his tone light but with an edge of seriousness. "Well, looks like it's just us now. You, me, and the rest of your ragtag team of misfits." Ren leaned against the console, her spear resting at her side. "Misfits, huh? That's rich coming from the youngest Vanduke in the multiverse." Scotty, still adjusting to the call sign clipped to his belt, smirked. "Yeah, but at least he's got a cool backstory." "What's ours?" "Group of high school dropouts fights monsters." Johnny chuckled, shaking his head. "We've got more than enough to keep us busy. Orphan, you're sticking around for a reason, so let's not waste time. What's next?" The orphan's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a more thoughtful expression. "Next? You keep training. You've got the tools and the start of the skills, but there's still a lot you don't know. And with the multiverse being what it is, I'd say we don't have long before the next challenge shows up." Shade, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "We've also got the scanners. If anything happens, anomalies, disturbances, anything, we'll know about it. Lancaster is a hotspot, and it's only going to get hotter." Ren nodded. "So we get ready. Fortify the mill, train harder, and keep an eye on the scanners. When the next monster shows up, we'll be ready." Johnny looked at his team, the faint glow of the loom mill's upgraded systems casting a steady light over them. For the first time since this began, he felt a sense of control, a sense of purpose. "We're not just surviving anymore," he said, his voice firm. "We're fighting back." The orphan grinned, the mischievous spark returning to his eyes. "Now you're talking, Johnny. Let's make the nightmares afraid of the dark."